we would want to have. So what I'm doing today is a kind of general introduction, and then, as you know from the correspondence we've sent out so far, we do have, as we always do, some guest speakers on various topics, and they will be the center point of discussion that we have in the future. I should point out that Terry Shelton is normally with us, but at the present time he's in Spokane taking care of grandchildren, twins, so double trouble, I guess, or double joy. So Terry will not be with us today, but presumably most, if not all, the rest of the sessions, and the same for me. What I'm going to do this morning is to do a kind of general lay of the land in terms of politics and public policy, kind of where we are. And I'm going to start out with some general discussion, with a general discussion of the atmosphere and polarization and the like. Then talk a bit about President Biden's record thus far and the challenges that he has faced successfully and those that still are there in front of him. And then do a kind of general assessment of the future for Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then move from that to the state of Wisconsin and where we stand in Wisconsin. So with that in mind, let me talk about the current political culture that we have, which, as you know, includes a lot of conflict, a lot of anxiety. Polarization is a term that is used commonly and appropriately for where we are today. And to put it in perspective, there's always been polarization. There's always been partisanship. A lot of people think of Mitch McConnell, for example, as the devil incarnate because of his behavior as a minority or majority leader in the Senate, and not moving forward on a lot of the priorities that other people might think are need attention. But you know, we've had that kind of behavior pretty constantly. That's not all that unusual. What is and part of it is policy differences. People having different perspectives on what the problems are and what the solutions should be. Part of it is brand loyalty, and a lot of people forget about brand loyalty. And we have brand loyalty in terms of cars and brands of Kleenex and things like that. See, I just used a term that betrays my brand loyalty for tissue paper. There are a lot of people who have brand loyalty to parties as well. They're going to vote for a Democrat, no matter who the Democrat is. They're going to vote for a Republican. Doesn't make any difference who the Republican candidate is or who the Democratic candidate is. And that's an important part of our politics. It's an important part of the calculations of anybody's campaign. You sort of take that as a given. That becomes kind of your base, and then you can kind of go from there. What is different, however, and there are differences, is the level of hostility, the kind of loyalty, if you will, to our institutions and traditions. One big contrast, for example, is when Al Gore lost the presidential race, and compare that to when Donald Trump lost the presidential race. Both in a situation where the popular vote was very close. Al Gore actually got more popular votes than George W. Bush did. There was, as you know, a very, very contentious situation in Florida, which then was resolved by the United States Supreme Court. And if anybody had the basis for being really thinking about conspiracy theories and being very hostile, it was Al Gore, but he didn't. He felt compelled to admit defeat and to provide congratulations to George W. Bush. We really have not had that kind of behavior or reaction by Donald Trump. He was a different kind of person and a different kind of politician. He has portrayed himself as a victim, despite the wealth that he enjoys. He has used the division to generate a heck of a lot of money. A lot of people have not realized that whole dimension, but he's just generated lots and lots of contributions to various funds that he controls, as well as to his own kind of informal campaign fund. Since his defeat, he's generated over $300 million that is ready for him to use for himself and to help other candidates. And he's built this on fear, on resentment, which is what he did when he campaigned. But he's kind of demanded a loyalty from other Republicans that is really pretty unusual. And the word primary has become a verb. And the threat is that if you don't provide a lot of loyalty to the former president, that you may be primaried. In other words, that there will be a candidate in the Republican Party to try and get you out of office. We've had that phenomenon happen here in Wisconsin, and indeed in the late 90s and early 2000, polarization in Wisconsin became a major issue. And in large part, that was driven by people being primaried, party leaders at the state level, getting sometimes some very, very highly respected long-term legislators and public servants out of office because they dared to disagree with the Assembly Speaker or the Senate Majority Leader, Republican in one case, Democrat in the other. So it's a major issue. And if you want to be in office, being primaried and that threat is a major kind of thing. The kind of base loyalty that Trump enjoys is clearly a minority of the electorate, but they're also they are dangerous. And we have had other cases. I mean, the most dramatic situation that we can think of happened in our lifetimes. Those of us who are PLATO members and eligible to be called seniors. In Germany, Nazi Germany, the Nazis were a minority of the politicians. They had the minority support in the German electorate, but we know what happened there. And they're dangerous because there is a disregard for truth. You can't have a policy discussion or disagreement based on the merit. They have a disregard for traditions. They are based on hate, and they have as the subjects of their hate people who disagree with them and who are different from them. And I think we all know what we're talking about. They're willing, and this is what's really new and disturbing, is as we saw a year ago, January 6th, they're willing to engage in violence. And we've had violence since then. Actually, there was violence before January 6th. That was just the most visible case. And continued threats of violence that the FBI is trying to chase down and the like. Now, the midterm elections, and we're going to talk about that in a little while, are coming up. And I think a major question in this regard is whether or not in the midterm elections, Republican leaders in particular, who are not loyal to Trump, are going to prevail over opposition that they are facing from Trump loyalists. The real question as to the future of the kind of role that Donald Trump plays in the Republican Party and in our body politic. Part of the context in which all of this is taking place, of course, is we have a new president, President Biden, in large part, he was elected because people wanted a break from the hostilities, the name calling, the kind of hate, sort of personal set of behaviors that we encountered prior to Biden. People wanted a break from that. They wanted to get together and have much more unity and civility. Biden was really riding on that kind of hope, and he rode it all the way into the White House. He's had clearly some positive accomplishments. Probably the biggest one in terms of public policy has been the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed early in his administration, providing about $1.3 trillion for roads and highways and internet and a number of other kinds of infrastructure, what we usually refer to as infrastructure. His social infrastructure bill, as it had been called, the Build Back Better, has floundered. And in part, that's been Democratic divisions, two people in particular who have been obstacles, but also a number of other factors which we can go into. COVID is a major issue. Wow. I mean, it's just, I think we're all really just sick of it. It dominates our conversation. It's disruptive to our lives. We're done. We're done with it. But it's a mixed bag in terms of what Biden has been able to do. In part, of course, some of this is really out of his control. You get a new variant of the virus, and that's nothing that the president had anything to do with. The vaccine rollout was not bad. The mandate issue has become very difficult and has been politicized. It's a partisan divide. If you want to read a good book about not only viruses and pandemics, but medical history generally, it's the Great Influenza, about the 1918-1919 pandemic that we had. And a lot of people concerned about, well, what's this vaccine all about? Is it dangerous? Am I better off trying some other approach or just hunkering in? A lot of issues confronted then that we now face, but without the party loyalty behind it. It wasn't Republicans versus Democrats. It was just people having disagreements, sometimes really serious disagreements, but very different than what we've had here. Biden is dealing with a lot of opposition to him, and a lot of people disappointed because of the voting rights bill not getting passed. And again, in part, he's pushed for it, but people who are thinking that he could have pushed more strategically or faster or more disappointed that hasn't happened. In part, that's a congressional issue. Same thing with climate change. The young people in particular are very, very concerned about climate change. I mean, you and I are as well, but talk with your grandchildren about climate change. Wow, that's clearly number one on their list of concerns. And a lot of people really disappointed that not as much as possible could have been done on climate change. Again, the will seems to be there, but the results not so. Inflation, I mean, that's something that's affecting everybody. 7% rate of inflation lately. That's a major issue. The supply chain issue, you're familiar with that. Just cars, I mean, just everything kind of bogged down. And in part, the supply chain issue has really affected inflation and helped to drive prices up. Simple supply demand kind of dynamics. The worker shortage is another issue. Wow, you just help wanted signs all over the place. And again, that's driving costs up. It causes delays because you don't have enough workers to get something done. And it's one of those things, again, where you can say, well, that's not got anything to do with the president. You can debate whether or not the president does bear some responsibility. Point is that, and it wouldn't make any difference who's in the White House, we do lay some blame on the White House and the leadership coming out of there. Two international issues that Biden has faced, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. On the one hand, just about everybody very, very grateful that we've gotten out of that quagmire. That was a long, long battle, a long commitment, and a very costly commitment to the United States. And we really didn't accomplish much. And the withdrawal, however, was probably going to be messy no matter what. And we can talk about some of the factors that went into that. That was really because of the way that Trump committed to withdrawing from Afghanistan, to the intelligence failures that made the president and the rest of us expect a bit more orderly kind of possible withdrawal. But it wasn't. And it reminded a lot of us of the withdrawal in Vietnam, in Saigon, and how messy and bloody that was. And again, that's something that the president is blamed for, and his poll numbers have gone down accordingly. The Ukraine messy situation, that's ongoing. It's by the way, I don't know how many of you know it, but the ambassador of the United States to the United Nations is a University of Wisconsin graduate, actually a former student of mine. So we've got some local connections there. And Linda gave a major speech outlining the United States concerns and our policy in the Ukraine before the Security Council yesterday. So the Biden assessment is one where it's mixed. For the most part, people, I think, are disappointed that there hasn't been a better situation with the pandemic, with the economy. One can point to some good things, but most of the attention, not surprisingly, has been to the bad. And I would pause here to urge a caution, and I do this with all of the credentials of a political scientist, and it is, don't trust the polls. You know this from the past few years, but the polls, particularly now, they give you some kind of indication, but there are a lot of flaws. And we can talk about some of those flaws if you'd like, but the point is that there's a lot of polling going on. The polls are mixed in some cases on whatever the issues are. Sometimes they're much more negative feeling than one would get. And I would just urge that whether or not we're talking about a poll that's a general poll of how are you feeling, how you think the country's going, those kinds of questions, or if it's a poll about the elections coming up this fall, who you're going to vote for. There just are a lot of problems with the polls, particularly now. We might get more precise on the election polls as we get closer to November, but be careful. So let me talk about Congress for a moment. And there will be time for you to ask questions and the like, but just let me outline everything, because a lot of the stuff kind of goes together. House of Representatives, you need 218 members of the House of Representatives from your party to have a majority. The Democrats have 222. So we've got 4 more than a majority. Pretty thin. And to talk about polls, one of the general findings of the polls is that the Democrats are not only going to lose that majority, but they're really going to lose that majority. And that may very well be true. But there are a lot of ifs that go with that. People will point to the historical pattern, which is true, that the party that does not control the White House, typically in the midterm elections, which for us is the one coming up in November, that party is the one that suffers the most. There are exceptions to that, but a general pattern is that turnout is lower in the midterm, and people generally blame the party that is in control of the White House for whatever problems there are at the time. Probably even more importantly, this time around is the gerrymandering. Gerrymandering that has already taken place in a lot of states, that is taking place in others. The gerrymandering you just take a look at the boundaries that have been drawn up so far and the controversies. You go to Kansas City, you go to various communities in Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and you can just see the boundaries being redrawn in ways that put Democrats in, so that there are a lot more Democrats in a particular district in order to give Republicans an edge on the other districts. And so you can talk about Nashville, for example. Clearly, the way that those boundaries are drawn, if the people continue to vote the way they have been voting, given their location, there are going to be 2 seats that the Democrats lose there. So you can go around the country and see that. Courts have been involved, and interestingly, the courts in Ohio, controlled by Republicans, their legislature and governor, they've come up with 2 different maps for redistricting, and the courts in Ohio said, no, those are clearly unconstitutional. The gerrymandering is too much in favor of the incumbent Republicans. You could have suits like that in Maryland attacking the Democrats. Gerrymandering is really a major issue, and it certainly is a major issue for Wisconsin, as I think we all know. For the Senate, where it's 50-50 in terms of the Republican-Democratic split, it's a bit more complicated than in the House, where everybody is up for re-election. Here, of course, it's 1/3 of the Senate, 1/3 of the 100 senators are up every 2 years. And this time around, the 1/3 actually rounds up to 34 seats. Now, if you take a look at the math, and you realize that, well, Democrats need go from 50 to 51 to stay in the majority, or at least get 50, given the fact that the vice president can break ties. It looks like Democrats are in good shape, just mathematically. There are 30. First of all, take a look at, well, okay, if there are 34 seats that are up for election, what about the ones that aren't, the 2/3 of the seats that aren't? Well, Democrats are in the majority of those 2/3. There are 36 Democrats and 30 Republicans that are not up for re-election. So doing the math really means that of the 34 seats who are up, the Democrats need to pick up 15 of the 34. Would seem to be doable, huh? And you look at Pennsylvania, you look at North Carolina, we'll talk about Wisconsin in a second. Those look like some good opportunities for Democrats to pick up seats taken away from Republicans. The Republicans, on the other hand, are looking at Arizona and Georgia as their best opportunities for replacing a current Democratic legislator with a Republican. These are ones you could really contest. Here in Arizona, the Democratic candidate, Mark Kelly, won very handily last time. He's very, very popular. The Republicans are in disarray. Their candidate is, they don't have a specific candidate yet, but the likely candidate is someone who is very much a Trump Republican. Trump lost in Arizona. So it's sort of like, well, you can make an argument that maybe the Republicans won't pick up a state here. They're counting on a lower turnout among the Democrats, which is traditional, and the fact that Arizona normally is in the Republican column, despite the fact that Biden won here last time by a narrow margin. Georgia, similarly, you can argue back and forth about whether or not the Democrats really are in trouble there. And Herschel Walker, the very well-known football player, is the Republican candidate. He's got some problems personally and politically. This is his first try for a political office. So in other words, you can do the math, but then you get into the specifics on these and the general kinds of patterns of, well, if you control the White House, you're probably not going to win. That's a general pattern, but we really need specifics, especially when it is so close. And a lot of it depends on the primaries. And in the Republican Party, one of the real big questions is the one that I kind of posed a little while ago, which is that if the Trump presence and Trump influence prevails in the midterm election, that is going to really set forth a scenario that's very different if there's a repudiation of Trump. And the Washington Post this morning reported on fundraising by Republicans that have been targeted by Trump as not being loyal, and therefore that they ought to be defeated in the primaries. And Liz Cheney is probably the most visible person in this particular category. And she has raised almost 5 times as much money for her reelection as her Trump-backed supporter. So they're sort of like, well, money really, it makes a difference in campaigns, that's for sure. Lisa Murkowski, similarly, in Alaska. Fred Upton in Michigan is out raising his Trump-backed supporter. So there's some indication that maybe enough Republicans have said, okay, enough of this kind of being so influenced and dominated by one particular individual. We really need to have him retire and play more golf and get somebody else in office. So let me use that as a sort of segue into the situation in Wisconsin. First, talk about the Senate, and then talk about the gubernatorial race. Ron Johnson has, and as I'm sure you know, decided that he will indeed run for a third term. And he has some major advantages. Incumbents generally have an advantage in running for re-election. They've got a lot of name recognition. They won elections before, and they're going back to some of those same people and say, support me again. And a lot of those people will say, well, okay, we'll do that. Also, there's that general issue of he's a Republican, we've got a Democrat as a president in the White House. And so there's that general feeling by some voters of we're not happy with various things, inflation and supply chain and vaccines, and we're going to really support the party that has not been in control. He's got some disadvantages too. And if you've been even glancing at the news over the last few years, he's got a mouth that probably a lot of people wish would have some duct tape applied to it. He says a lot of things that are terribly embarrassing. He doesn't, and he's very, very specific about being anti-science. And he really does not think that truth matters. We could go on, and there are a lot of specifics, some of them funny, but a lot of them really alarming, coming out of somebody who is supposed to be a statewide leader and a major figure in the United States Senate. So those are things that people will point to and indicate that, well, maybe there's a chance for the Democrats to get one of those 15 seats, 15 of the 34 seats that are up. Maybe Wisconsin can contribute one of them. And I think there is a possibility, but it's not a surefire thing. It really is not. And it's got to be treated very, very seriously. He's a very serious threat. He's going to have a lot of support from outside the state of Wisconsin, financially and in other ways. And it's a real challenge running against somebody who is well known, even if they're well known for some comments that many of us would find absolutely amazing in a negative kind of way. So what's important here? Well, obviously turnout is going to be important. And that is a mantra that we can repeat often. The other issue is, well, who's going to be the Democratic candidate? So you can talk about somebody as in a negative or positive way, but as we know, when it comes to the voting in November, you're voting between two different people, or primarily two different people. Just a quick run through on the Democratic side, which is pretty crowded now. I'm not going to talk about all of the candidates, but let me just talk about the major ones. Mandela Barnes, our lieutenant governor. He has a lot of name recognition, having been lieutenant governor and run statewide and won with Tony Evers. He has a sound base in Milwaukee, and particularly for Democrats running in a primary. That's very important. And he has a lot of endorsements from other Democratic leaders, endorsements from a variety of organizations and the like, and that's important. In terms of funds, he doesn't have more money than anybody else, but he's got a substantial amount of money. And the important thing for Mandela Barnes is that most of his money is coming from small to medium-sized contributions rather than big donors and the like. In contrast, Alex Lasry, who is an executive part owner of the Milwaukee Bucks, that's probably one of his most attractive features, given the world champion Milwaukee Bucks and their popularity. He's no doubt responsible for the hook shots and the dribbling and the rebounding in particular. He's himself is very, very wealthy. His father is a billionaire, and he and his father get along well. He's young and he's articulate, and excuse me. He has endorsements, some major endorsements, politically speaking, especially for the primary, from labor unions. And in part, that's because of the way he has treated labor and the labor unions in building the arena where the Bucks play their games. He has contributed over $2 million himself as a loan to his campaign. Whether you think of it as a loan or, well, that's just technically a loan, it's really a gift, remains to be seen. But the point is that he's got a lot of money. In fact, he's got more money than any of the other Democratic candidates. And he's already running TV ads, which is probably a smart thing strategically. Sarah Godleski is our state treasurer. She's another major candidate. She's also a multimillionaire and has also provided almost as much money to her campaign as Lasry has contributed to his campaign. Having been a state treasurer, she has run a statewide race and won. She's been able to get a lot of support from small towns around Wisconsin and from rural areas. And that's a distinct advantage that as a Democrat who can maybe count on a good solid support from Madison and Milwaukee, being able to get support from small towns is a real positive. And she's another person who's very articulate. Tom Nelson, who is the Outagamie County executive, actually Outagamie County is where I originally came from, and that's a very Republican area. It's Joe McCarthy territory historically, and it's traditionally been a real source of Republican support. Nonetheless, Tom Nelson has won in Outagamie County, and he's won in a couple of races. So he can make an argument that, well, when it comes to the general election, he's been able to get support from Republicans, and so Democrats might be well advised to support him in the primary so that he becomes the candidate, and he might be better positioned to beat Ron Johnson than the other candidates. All of the candidates that I've mentioned on the Democratic side are pretty much on the same wavelength in terms of their policy. They are left of center, they're progressives. Some differences on healthcare issues, but generally there's not a whole lot to distinguish them in terms of policy. The big question for Democrats, I think, as they consider these candidates and consider who they're going to vote for in the primary, is who's going to beat Ron Johnson. Forget everything else, who's going to beat Ron Johnson? So the electability factor becomes pretty critical. Governor, obviously Tony Evers, incumbent. He's built up a nice treasury in terms of a campaign funds. He really has broken all sorts of records in getting campaign funds. So he's pretty well positioned financially. The two leading candidates at this point on the Republican side are Rebecca Kleefisch, who was lieutenant governor under Scott Walker. She has a lot of name recognition, particularly among Republicans. She's probably got to be, she has to be regarded as a favorite in the Republican primary, just given the fact that she's been lieutenant governor working in the Republican Party for quite some time and the like. In terms of her positions, they're extreme right. She's a Christian evangelistic, very, very fundamentalist, and very proud and public about that. Her position on women's rights, for example, shows that she does not believe that there is a climate change. She has taken some very extreme positions on suppressing the vote, restricting the vote among people in Wisconsin, claiming, despite evidence, that there's all sorts of fraud, and we need to make major changes to combat all of this fraud. She has the endorsement at this point of Wisconsin Manufacturers of Commerce, the major lobbying group for the business community. Kevin Nicholson is her major opponent. He just got in the race about a week ago, although he'd been saying that he was going to get in the race if Ron Johnson ran for a third term. Nicholson, as you may recall, ran against Leah Vukmir for the Republican nomination for the Senate against Tammy Baldwin. And Leah Vukmir beat her, and then, of course, Tammy ended up beating Leah Vukmir. He has an incredible amount of support from Richard Uihlein, a multimillionaire with lots of property and business in Wisconsin. He's technically he's living in Illinois right now. But just as an example, he wrote out checks for $11 million for Nicholson when he ran for the U.S. Senate in that losing effort. And he has already pledged that he will spend whatever is necessary to make Nicholson the winner in the Republican primary and then the winner in the general election. Interestingly, Uihlein's spouse, Liz Uihlein, has written a check for almost $250,000 to Rebecca Kleefisch. So not sure what the discussion is over breakfast, but could be that they're going to just agree to disagree, or maybe one of them will change their mind. Eric Hovde, a business person, is another possibility as a Republican candidate. And Tommy Thompson has said that, well, he liked being governor and he might run to be governor again. My own assessment is that Tommy has always loved playing around with people and having some attention on himself. And I think he's just trying to not necessarily be funny, but play a game. One of the interesting things about Nicholson and Kleefisch is that their difference on policy issues is really pretty minimal. Nicholson's big attack, which he's levied for some time and very loudly in the last few days, is that he feels like he's running against the Republican machine. And by the Republican machine, he's talking about, of course, Voss and Kleefisch, and then all of the Republican leaders who have endorsed Kleefisch, Walker and people close to Scott Walker. So Kevin Nicholson is sort of saying, well, it's time to retire the machine, and we'll see where that goes. The final thing I might point out before opening it up for your questions and comments is that Kleefisch and Nicholson have both come out recently against the Wisconsin Election Commission, a very interesting kind of common attack. The Republicans under Walker set up the Wisconsin Election Commission 5 years ago. And they wanted to set it up the way they did, with making it even between Republicans and Democrats on the commission. Not clear sometimes exactly what its authority might be and the like. But even though it was created by Republicans and a lot of Republicans support the election commission, the attack on Wisconsin's participation in the presidential election, led by Johnson and other people close to Trump, has really made the Elections Commission a focus of attention, as if they are responsible, either through negligence or something even more nefarious, for the corruption that occurred in the Wisconsin election. There have been studies done and court cases and the like, not a lot of evidence, but that really doesn't matter. And it's not entirely clear what they want to replace the Wisconsin Election Commission with. But it's another one of these cases where what we've got, which is really unusual, is this constant barrage of charges that are not based on fact, that are attacking our basic institutions, our basic processes, or basic traditions of democracy. And as I said at the outset, I'm concerned about that. I really am. I'm generally a very optimistic kind of person, but I'm alarmed at what is going on right now and the attacks on democracy and democratic institutions in the United States and in Wisconsin. So, questions, comments?
I have a question, Dennis. Or I don't know if you do.
Sure.
What's your take on the January 6th committee that's investigating, everything that went on? You think they have a chance of being effective, and if so, in a timely way?
Yeah, good question, Tim. I think that they've already been effective. I think that they have already generated some information that has been useful in terms of specifics. The recent apprehension of Oath Keeper, their leadership is an example of that. They have been able to get information which we haven't seen entirely about discussions not only in the White House but in hotel rooms and things like that have been going on for months, talking about the conspiracy. It wasn't just a gut feeling. I mean, one interpretation of January 6th was that, well, you had all these people and they were not happy with the results of the election and they got together in Washington and got carried away. Well, it wasn't that. And I think that they've already documented that it was much more organized. There was much more of a conspiracy behind it. It was not just a group of protesters that got carried away. And I think that their goal was to create a report like the 9/11 Commission report, which has got to go down as one of the incredibly valuable and best written. Holy cow! I mean, it reads like the author of a novel would write it. Incredible report. And they wanted to really have something like the 9/11 report and present us with a really complete, well understood accounting for what went on and what didn't go on, the role of the president, but not only the role of the president at the time, but the role of a lot of other people like the Oath Keepers and the like, who had for years been against the United States and against government. One of the things that happened was that Trump kind of provided an empowerment in a way for a lot of groups that had been in existence for quite some time. They were vigilante groups. I mean, we had some of those, posse comitatus, remember that in Wisconsin history? Groups like that were very much anti-government, they were prone to violence and the like. And what happened over the 4 years, and then particularly with the defeat of Trump and the conspiracies, was the empowerment of a lot of these groups. So I think that the 9/11 Commission it appears they're getting the information that they needed and wanted in order to really outline this and document it. Hopefully they can get some of the same writers that were used in the 9/11 Commission. And I think it's, Congress does not have the power to try people as guilt or innocence. The role of Congress in an investigation, any investigation, is to determine whether or not legislation is needed, and if so, what kind of legislation. And so one of the things that can come out of this is some legislation that might make another attack on the Capitol less likely. But what happens a lot of times, and what I think is happening here, is that it's generating information that then the Department of Justice uses to pursue it in court and bring criminal charges against people. And so there's really that twofold. But again, it's important, and this happened with Watergate, that when Congress starts investigating something, one of the key issues that a court usually resolves, in both cases has resolved, is, well, is Congress legitimately investigating something, or is this just a partisan witch hunt, as it's been called? And both with Watergate as well as with January 6th, the courts have said, no, this is legitimate. But again, it's legitimate for lawmaking purposes, but it's also generating information that can be used in criminal prosecutions. That was a short answer, wasn't it?
Can you talk about the Wisconsin Electoral College false electors?
Yes, there is there's a Fed. Well, first of all, I'll try not to be too lengthy, but let me start out with the United States Constitution. When it talks about the Electoral College and the role of states in the Electoral College, it uses very general language, and it says that the states shall determine how to set up their Electoral College and who's going to be the electors. And then you go to the state laws to find out how that happens. And in the states of Nebraska and Maine, for example, it talks about the electors being generated by the vote statewide and the vote in each congressional district. And so there's a possibility in those states of having some of their electors vote for one presidential candidate and other electors voting for another candidate. Wisconsin, like the other 48 states, has in its law a statement that says that the parties, the major political parties, and that's defined elsewhere, major political parties, before the election takes place, shall submit a slate of electors. They shall determine who the electors are. So before we ever voted, the Republicans had a slate of electors, the Democrats had a slate of electors. Then what Wisconsin says is, okay, the slate of electors that actually participate in the Electoral College is the slate of electors committed to the presidential candidate that won the popular vote in the state. And it says popular vote, it doesn't say majority, anything like that, just the popular vote. Now, what happened in Wisconsin and Michigan and a couple of other states is that after the vote was taken, Joe Biden won. Therefore, according to Wisconsin law, the slate of electors that the Democratic Party put forth, they were the ones who were told, okay, you vote in the Electoral College. Now we've got another provision in there that says, and indeed, you vote for the presidential candidate of the party that won. If you don't, something called a faithless elector, and we've had a couple of those throughout history, then you can be replaced and you can actually be fined. Not all states have that kind of a provision, most do, so that people are bound. Okay, so the Republicans, and this was one of the things that the commission that's investigating the January 6th incident was able to document, is that a number of the lawyers and the like close to Trump they contacted states where Trump lost and said, why don't you have the electoral slate of the Republican Party send forth, and technically they have to send it to the archivist of the United States. You have them send in their votes. So then there will be two slates from Wisconsin, and they're both sending in their candidates that each slate is sending in their votes. And the Republicans in the states, including Wisconsin, that agreed to participate in that actually used very official looking documents. Procedurally, they followed everything and sent it off to the archivist, with the idea being that that Vice President Pence then would be presented with supposedly a dilemma. Which slate do we recognize? With the idea that then, maybe this is going to slow everything down, bring it to a halt, and we'll throw it out to a vote of the Congress, which was controlled by the Republicans. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch in Wisconsin, the law is very, very clear. It's in chapter 5, I believe. It says that anybody who impersonates the electors, anybody who sends forth false documents, which of course is what happened here, is guilty of a crime. And that now is being pursued. Initially, it was the Attorney General, Call, was thinking of pursuing this, but decided, no, let's let the feds do it. So the Department of Justice is now pursuing this false electoral slate issue and the people who asserted that they had the right to cast the votes for Wisconsin. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Good. And let me just add one more thing, and that is that given the general statement in the Constitution saying it's up to the states to figure out all the nuances and how they're going to cast their electoral votes, there is a movement among some states to say very specifically, regardless of the popular vote on election day, it is up to the legislature to determine which slate of electors is going to be recognized and participate in the Electoral College. That will run counter to, well, you could argue that it's going to run counter to the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, but it would run counter to the Federal Electoral Count Act with a capital E, C, and A. And that says that if there's any kind of ambiguity or confusion in the states, that the governor is the one who determines which slate is to be certified and recognized as official.
Dennis, there's since the subject of the January 6th Commission and electors and the 14th Amendment came up, today in Politico, Bruce Ackerman, political science law at Yale, has written an article about Article 14, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which disqualifies any federal official who has taken an oath to support the Constitution who is engaged in insurrection from holding another federal office, unless 2/3 of the Congress lifts that disqualification. And Ackerman suggests that there's been conversations among Democrats and that possibly the 1/6 Commission, maybe that would be a outcome that might occur of that, which then could generate a constitutional crisis if when Kamala Harris opens the ballots, if electoral votes come in from someone who's been found engaging in insurrection against the United States, is he not qualified to take an oath? Interesting. Also today, Donald Trump called on the 1/6 Commission to investigate why Mike Pence did not overturn that election. As you know, now that's the nonsense. But Bruce Ackerman has an interesting article. Any thought on Article 14, Section 3, and disqualifying Trump for engaging in insurrection?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Bruce is a very highly respected scholar. So I think that's all got to be treated very seriously. But as you say, boy, you can imagine a scenario which is really going to be messy with a capital M. Yeah.
So Dennis, I have a
Chris?
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What happens on assuming that you're correct and that the Republicans take over the House, what happens next January 20th to this commission? If it's still, will it be just closed down by the Republican majority?
That's highly likely. And it's this is providing indeed some sense of urgency for the committee to complete its work and reveal its documents. Again, it's already reported a lot of its evidence to the Department of Justice. So to some extent, it's already completed some work, but it really would like to wrap things up and have a complete report with a paperclip or staple or something and submit it. Because you can safely predict that the Republican leadership would just shut down the commission. They were invited to participate, and as you may recall, and then initially said yeah, and then they submitted some people that were really perceived to be individuals that would bog down the committee and be very disruptive. And so Speaker Pelosi said, no, we're not going to do that. And I'm going to appoint the Republican members of the commission. And she did. And those people, well, one, Kinzinger is not going to run for reelection. And Liz Cheney, we talked about before, she's running for reelection. She's very determined. I have a number of friends who are in Wyoming, and they say she's doing a real grassroots campaign. She's raised a lot of money. She's very serious about getting reelected, in part as vindication.
Dennis, I'm wondering if you personally were surprised by how deep this conspiracy runs, because cynical as I am, I'm quite surprised. And as this was, before it happened on the 6th, I thought, oh, there really isn't any danger. The military will escort Trump out of the White House. But there's so many military and police people in these right-wing groups, or ex-police and military. Does that concern you that these institutions won't function either?
Yeah, I had the same perspective, same expectation that you did. I am very surprised at the depth of the conspiracy, how long it had been going on. The evidence, like with Oath Keepers and the like, where they had really been training and planning and gathering arms and all of that sort of stuff, even before Election Day, just anticipating the possibility, from their standpoint, the probability of doing it. And for some of these groups, it seems clear that they really appreciated the opportunity. They saw this as an opportunity to pursue their agenda and to make America back into the country that they mythically picture as, or they picture in a mythical sort of way as, a different kind of United States controlled by white men. The other concern is with law enforcement officials and military personnel who are really part of all this. It's not just ex-military that were involved in the insurrection. There's evidence in a debate right now about exactly what to do with it, about people who are in the military, about people who are police officers at all levels, who are really a part of these organizations. You know, it sort of reminds you of that whole period of the Ku Klux Klan domination and activity in the southern states after the Civil War, where, you know, the county sheriff would have a badge on during the day and at night get his white hood and put it on. We really make an assumption that our police officers are going to uphold the law, and rather than decide when the law really needs to be broken and be at the front of breaking that law.
Hey, Dennis, this is Wes Marshall. Can you comment on what I perceive as a strength the Republicans have in messaging, that their messages are concise and tight and repeatable and easily passed around? I worry that I watch Fox News to see what's going on. I read Fox News to see what's going on. I sometimes follow the Wall Street Journal, and I think if you do only those two news sources, or if you live in a rural area where Sinclair Broadcasting is putting out their message, you sincerely believe the election was stolen, that the Democrats dumped hundreds of thousands of ballots, and this short message that it was stolen isn't countered by a equally strong Democratic message. The Democratic messages are paragraphs long versus stolen election. And I think it's a real strength that the Republicans have that is an issue.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've been concerned about that too. I mean, and in part, if the Democrats' message is, no, it was not stolen, which is kind of what the message is, well, you know, there's something in communication theory that says, don't repeat the phrase that you're trying to counter. When you say, no, it's not stolen, no, it's not stolen, it gets the message across that, must have been stolen, huh? And so that's not a good way of dealing with it. I think sometimes the Democrats, and I'm certainly not this way at all. I mean, I'm very concise, and very, you know, you can take my statements, put them on a bumper sticker. I don't go on at length and get into the nuances, but Democratic spokespeople kind of do. And I'm reminded of, there's a good friend of mine, very well-known economist, who very early on as the election returns were coming in this past time around, provided what you might call the intellectual basis for saying that the election was stolen. And what he did is, I mean, there's this kind of gut feeling that a lot of people have as the election returns are coming in, right? You're treating it as if it's an athletic contest. That, oh, you know, so-and-so's ahead, so-and-so's ahead. Oh, look, nope. Oh, you know, here's some more returns. And so you treat it in this kind of dynamic way that makes for good news and good commentary. Well, when you look at it that way, it does look like the election might have been stolen. And that's what this guy's whole comment was that if you take the trend that was occurring and what we know of the votes that were counted at usually a relatively early time, that Trump was ahead. And then Biden wins. They count all these ballots and Biden is the winner. How did that happen? And he did a calculation and said that if you sort of were putting the chances on a dynamic like that occurring, the chances were, it was something like a little bit less than 2% chance that that would happen. So in other words, he's making an assumption that the pattern of the early returns is going to continue. And for it to get reversed, something nefarious. And I mean, Charles knows better, I'm sure. But it became the basis for a lot of the spokespersons in the Republican Party to say, hey, you know, this is the evidence. See, we're right. And so to say that it was stolen, it's right. It's there. I mean, to some extent, Trump was saying that it would be stolen, but he wasn't really using those terms exactly. I mean, he was sort of saying that our elections are corrupt, and if I don't win, you know, that something bad was going on. And he did that when he was running the first time too, right? And then all of a sudden, you know, the elections were just fine, thank you. That doesn't explain why the Democrats can't hire people who are better at spinning things. Now, occasionally they do. Clearly, Barack Obama did. Barack Obama, you know, captured a feeling that we really had a better side that we can hope to achieve, that there were better times ahead, that the Bush years were, you know, they were bad militarily, they were bad economically, et cetera, et cetera. And so focusing on hope was a smart idea, and that's a bumper sticker. I heard one of the Democratic candidates for Senate for Wisconsin asked a question, what's your bumper sticker going to be? Had no clue. Had no clue. And he had, you know, he thought about it and he said, I don't know. I really don't know. Well, I mean, the election's in November, for crying out loud. And, you know, ads are being run.
Yeah, I was thinking specifically of the school choice issue in the South, where the Virginia governor just destroyed Terry McAuliffe because he said parents have a right to choose, and voting rights, which, I mean, nobody's against voting, except if you think the government's trying to federalize it, and the Democrats are trying to federalize elections, and they've made that an ugly sounding thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. The whole idea of critical race theory. Nobody teaches critical race theory. You know, does anybody, they use that term, do they even know? But boy, oh boy, you say critical race theory, and it gets people really, oh, they're alarmed. That's been used, you know, various anti-gay kinds of things that's happened. The abortion, you know, the abortion, you know, I'm against abortion. Well, isn't everybody against abortion? That's not the issue. The issue is, are you willing to let women have a choice over what happens to their own body? Well, that's a longer bumper sticker. And you know, I think that, you know, the right to life, yeah, wow, that's a cool bumper sticker. And they've won that debate. They've won the way of framing the issue. And it's hard for me to think of many examples on the other side, actually. There are some, but the labor unions have done a pretty good job at times in their campaigns of getting issues. Sometimes you have to, if you're going to have a bumper sticker type approach, sometimes you have to exaggerate or shade the truth a little bit in the interest of poetic license, I guess. But yeah, that is an issue, and it's been an issue for a long time. It's not a new issue.
Dennis, on the bumper sticker issue, Barack Barack Obama admits in his memoir that he didn't like the phrase, "yes, we can." And it was Michelle Obama who said, no, that's actually what it says. He wanted something longer. So get Michelle Obama on that.
Yeah, yeah, good point. Yeah, and we can all remember, not that it's something of the past, but Barack Obama had, I mean, he was a great orator, but it took him a while to get a sentence completed. So it's consistent with the idea of having something a little bit more nuanced and complicated with proper caveats and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Could you comment on the proposed legislation to lower the age for legal concealed carry? Where you think that's going to go and sort of?
I think it's going to go right to Governor Evers' veto pen. But I think that, like a lot of other legislative proposals that are being made in Wisconsin currently, that's not the point. They're not all that hopeful that they're actually going to get legislation. It's more about the messages that this sends. Now, for a lot of us, I think the message it sends is a pretty alarming one of why do these kids need concealed carry? Are they too protecting their families from some threat? Why do they need this? They need it because of the general assumption that the NRA has that if we all had a gun, that we'd all be safer and live in more peace. That that's the kind of society we ought to have, is where everybody's carrying a weapon, and then we're all going to be respectful to one another. Yeah, I think that, I really think it's just more of a message of we're in favor of the Second Amendment, and because it doesn't really, that legislation, I mean, back to the bumper sticker kind of analogy, it doesn't really, as far as I know, have the various caveats of what you would need to do if you're going to arm people for one reason and yet protect the rest of us from that person acting irresponsibly with that fatal weapon in their hands.
Dennis, one other prediction I will ask of you. Does Robin Vos, is he likely to return as speaker? I mean, we expect that the Republicans are going to win control of the assembly. Is there any conceivable world that there's enough votes that would say, Robin Vos is an embarrassment and the Gableman thing is an embarrassment? And
well, there is that sentiment among some legislators, Republican legislators, and some of them have actually been bold enough to state it in public. But boy, I cannot imagine that there are enough. Vos has very cleverly used both gerrymandering as well as the primarying, raising money. And I mean, what happens is, and this is fairly typical of people who pursue this for the sake of becoming a leader in their legislature, is he will raise money and identify somebody that is a candidate that he would support with that money. And the result is that person then becomes more beholden to Robin Vos for being in the legislature than to their constituents. And that's that's kind of scary. So that, you know, on the one hand, the gerrymandering is provides him with that opportunity to have these seats that Republicans can control, and then he just gets somebody and as I say, he sponsors them, and then threatens to withhold the sponsorship, and that means that he pretty much controls them, and that's the way you get party discipline. Party discipline is really it's a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, I think we can all remember a time when, for example, in Congress, you'd have a very powerful Republican like Everett Dirksen, who, I mean, and he was a partisan, man, he was a Republican, but he was also somebody who would sit down and negotiate with you, and he would reach out to Democrats and they would respond to him. And he had no problem at all with people in his caucus partnering with people in the Democratic caucus on some good legislation. And that kind of thing just doesn't happen much anymore. You think of, the control that Mitch McConnell has. It's, same kind of stuff as Robin Voss.
Dennis, a question about Ron Kind's congressional district. Do you have any prognosis about what's going to happen with that district?
I hesitate to predict. I think that's a potential Republican pickup, particularly if the gerrymandered maps that have been submitted by the legislature or something close to it are adopted. It's going to make what was already a district that was marginally supporting Democrats, including Ron Kind, is one that would support a Republican candidate. I think a lot of it depends on who the candidate is. The leading Republican candidate in that district right now is somebody who is a very ardent Trump supporter, and he's a kind of a local Ron Johnson. Now, the extent to which that becomes a liability, again, you got to factor in the whole issue of brand loyalty and things like that. But that La Crosse area, it has gone back and forth, and when it's gone Republican, like when it's gone Democratic, it up until recently, they moderates on both sides. Brian Rood used to represent that district, and in the Senate, in the Assembly, and then the Senate, and very moderate, very much a reasonable person that you could sit down and talk to, focus on what the problems are and what reasonable solutions there would be. But boy, not so much anymore.
Dennis, following on that, what do you think of Tony Evers's map having less changes than the Republicans, but actually being, if the criteria is the least possible changes to the existing map? I think he played it back at you with them. I just wonder what you think of it.
Well, I think that the Tony Evers map, not his commission. You're talking about his map, not the commission. Yeah. His map might have a chance in particularly Hagedorn on the court, may very well say this is a much more reasonable approach. Hagedorn seems to be adhering to that principle of least changes, which doesn't make any sense to me. If you've got a map that most people regard as flawed, why would you do a least change kind of approach? But if that's a given, and you're going to get constrained by, we're going to have as few changes as possible here, then the Evers map is is fairer than the legislatures. And Hagendorn may very well calculate, not just on substance, but also he may calculate that if they don't go with something more reasonable than the legislatures, then this whole thing is going to end up in federal court. And typically, state courts don't like to have federal courts stepping into something where, and in this situation, we're talking about federal and state having a type of jurisdiction over the same issue. But the feds will stay out of it if indeed it's a fair map, but it'll be more difficult to pursue that case there in federal court. Well, I have the bewitching hour. So why don't we call it quits? And again, yeah, just our usual good group, good discussion. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. And,
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure, you bet. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks a lot.
You bet.